This is the second generation American Standard Champion 4 toilet introduced around circa 2014 or 15 and is still made to this very day. I find it interesting that it took this long to finally redesign it, but here we are. And it really isn't that great, honestly. But let's take a look at it and see what it has to offer. The overall design of this toilet actually doesn't look as bad as the previous version. It actually has a nice stylization to it, even though it is kind of simplistic. The one thing I didn't like about the original Champion 4 is just the back end. On this one, it doesn't look as bad, and doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. So, similar to the other American Standard toilets in the 2010s, it was given the Cadet Pro treatment, where it's basically redesigned to be kind of similar to a Cadet Pro. And it also has a pretty large siphon jet as well. So the tank parts are pretty simplistic for a Champion 4. You got the handle, you got the fill valve, which is the fluid master, and you got the Champion 4 flush kit. As you can tell, it does seem kind of elevated a little bit, so it leaves a lot of water in the tank that could have been easily used, so a little bit of the water which you could have extended the flush with is kind of wasted. So that is very strange. This is also one of those toilets that claims it's using 1.6 gallons, but kind of flushes like a 1.28. You'll see in just a second. See what I mean? It's kind of short. It's also not very good. That being said, the pulling and siphon power is a little bit mixed. While the flush seems a little bit more powerful compared to the Cadet Pro, and the siphon is obviously there, the flush is just way too short, and you can't really extend it either, which is kind of a downgrade. Overall, it's very mixed, but I guess I've seen worse. The performance also takes a hit too. While it's nowhere near as bad as some other American Standard toilets, it's just okay, compared to the good performance of the first generation and the redesigned first generation of the Champion 4, or even the original Champion as well. It's kind of disappointing as well, considering that this thing was known for performing that well, and this version doesn't really perform all that great compared to its original version. Let's have a look at ball rinse now. It honestly is kind of bad. While it does have angled rim jets, the application of some of the rim jets is kind of questionable, and looks like some of them don't even work on this particular version. It could be better, a lot better honestly, but I've honestly seen worse from American Standard 2, which is not a great sign. Here's another angle. And that is the second generation American Standard Champion 4 toilet, a very mixed bag. It does have some slight improvements compared to the first generations, but it's also slightly downgraded too. It's just kind of in the middle, and for somebody claiming to be 1.6 gallons, it does seem a bit misleading. But let's put this toilet into the grading scale. Let's grade it. So originally I wasn't going to do a split scores, but after putting up with some other versions of the newer champions, yeah, it's going to be needed. The overall design of this toilet definitely looks a lot better than the first generation Champion 4, mostly with the tank to bowl connection. It doesn't stick out as much and actually looks more authentic, if you know what I mean. I actually don't mind this design. I give it a 6. Alright, let's talk about the tank parts, because here's the biggest problem. It's the main flushing mechanism, the Champion 4 flush valve. It's probably the second worst part that they've ever made outside the original Champion flush canister. At least with this you can kind of extend a flush, but there's a lot of water that doesn't get utilized considering that this thing is pretty elevated. And not to mention, this thing is so flimsy it's not even funny. Not to mention that, of course, the flushes are often very short, which causes issues of flushing out for some of these models, especially outside the Champion 4 realm. Because of this stupid flush canister and the many problems that it has, the tank parts are getting it free. Unsurprisingly, the quality control is bad. From inconsistent rim jets to inconsistent flushes to inconsistent performances, this thing definitely has it all. The sad thing is this is quote-unquote the better newer Champion, which is not saying much. With some of these other models like the Champion Pro, it gets so much worse somehow. which frankly isn't saying much, because this is still getting a 4. The Trapway design is pretty average, but as you'll soon find out, it really isn't the best. But at its highest, it's pretty serviceable. At most, I give it a 6. So on the present release, the flushes can be very inconsistent. Sometimes they work perfectly fine, other times they don't flush out properly. Although I notice it's more of a problem with other Champion models outside the Champion 4, which is weird. On the lower end scale though, the flushes can be pretty terrible and pretty short. On an extended flush, it frankly isn't much better. For something that claims to be using 1.6 gallons, it still flushes like a 1.28 gallon toilet. And probably the best reason to explain why that is because the Champion 4 canister is up high, which means that some water isn't even used at all. On the lower end scale, the flush gets a 2, on the high end scale, it's a 3. The bowl clearance is pretty inconsistent. At its lowest point, it can be kind of crappy. It may have its moments of actually flushing out properly fine, but there's some other moments that could have some hiccups. On the extended flush or the proper flush, it's still kind of bad. Again, if it actually had more water to use, it would actually be pretty okay. But because of the Champion 4 flush canister, it causes most of the problems. On the lower end scale, it gets a 3, on the high end scale, it gets a 4. The performance is pretty underwhelming, honestly. On the lower end scale, it's pretty crappy and it's pretty well known for clogging a lot. On the higher end scale, it's pretty meh. And considering the decently sized Trapway that they have, the performance is rather disappointing. On the lower end scale, it's easily a 3, while on the high end scale, at most, it's a 5. The bowl rinse is also pretty underwhelming as well, which is not very surprising for modern American standard. On the lower end scale, it's pretty terrible, because, well, the flush is way too short, and it barely does anything. On the higher end scale, it's still pretty bad, as it's pretty well known for leaving stains behind and having pretty questionable application. And not to mention the ramjet quality is not the best either. On the lower end scale, it's a 2, while on the high end scale, it's a 4. It should be no surprise that survivability is pretty low. On the lower end scale, it's an easy 3, while on the high end scale, the most I can give it is a 4. Now let's talk about the overall value of this toilet and see if it's worth getting, as it seems like this model is slowly getting discontinued and replaced with its current third generation. On the lower end scale, no. This thing has so many problems it's not even funny, and it's all because of the Champion 4 flush canister. If it wasn't for that, it still wouldn't be that great, but it would definitely be a lot better. Due to those issues, the value is a 3 on the low end scale. On the high end scale, when you utilize most of the flush, it's still a no. I do not recommend this model at all, as it's very underwhelming. There are just so many bad qualities still that it's just not worth putting up with. Now obviously the first generation Champion 4 had its bad moments too, but at least it had performance. It's not really a reason to get it, but something I would like to point out. The performance on this is definitely a lot worse, and the qualities are still bad if not worse. Even if this is quote unquote the better modern Champion, that really isn't saying all that much, because it's still pretty bad. So that being said, don't waste your time with this model. And honestly, it looks like the third generation Champion 4 is somehow even worse, but that will be a review for another day. Overall, the value on the high end scale is a 4. Now let's take a look at the final scores of the second generation American Standard Champion 4 toilet. On the low end scale, it's a 36 out of 100, while on the high end scale, it's a 44 out of 100. Yeah, this model's pretty bad. On the lower end scale, it's just very underwhelming and has a lot of major problems, while on the high end scale, not much has been improved. For a redesign, this model is pretty underwhelming, and somehow it got worse with the other Champion models. Oh boy, I can't wait to review those.